Hey everyone, time for another 3 at 3 on solar PV. I'm Jenn Runyon, Chief Editor of Renewable Energy World.
I'm Paula Mintz, Chief Market Research Analyst, SPV Market Research.
Hey Paula.
Hey, Jen.
Well, I'm going to chug through a little bit. I have a bit of a cold, so you may notice my voice is a little octave lower. Anyway, we take 3 topics and we discuss them for 3 minutes each. And we're going to talk today talk a little bit about the solar trade case against China. Maybe have an update on the Paris Agreement and Trump's decision to pull the U.S. away from it, and then touch a little bit on climate change. So, Paula, I have been deeply engrossed in other things and haven't been staying up to date on the trade case. So tell me, what have you been hearing?
Well, it's not just hearing. It's that now that SolarWorld, which has filed an intent to potentially lay off, I think they employ 800 people, I believe, or around that in Oregon, and they've joined Suniva. So that unfortunately means that the odds of something happening, it looks like November would be the earliest, although if there's an emergency action, it could be earlier than that. It looks like this may move ahead, and that affects everybody all up and down the value chain. So there are some things to really think about in terms of this. Number one is, who is this protecting? It's the U.S. manufacturing, of the cell, which is, I think I've said this before, the electricity generating device. Without the cell, you don't have a PV system.
That's the key part, yes.
Exactly. We have 1% of global manufacturing. We have, for crystalline, it would be SolarWorld and Suniva, and we have First Solar for CadTel. We have a smattering of CIGS, CIS. We have teeny little bit of amorphous and some other solar technologies, but it's crystalline that's affected.
Okay.
Because what this calls for is a minimum price of 78 cents and 40 cents on cells that are imported from anywhere if it's crystalline.
Wait, explain that. Minimum price and an additional?
As I understand it, and 40 cents on cells,
on
crystalline
top of that,
cells.
on top
right.
of the minimum price.
Right, but this affects crystalline. So whatever, you're looking at a country that has its share of manufacturing of the cell has slipped for quite a few years. And it really it's more complicated than just low-priced Chinese product in the country. It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah.
So what are you saving here? I mean, that's sad to say. 800 jobs to me is non-trivial. The jobs at Suniva is non-trivial. Having manufacturing in the U.S. of the cell and innovation here at home is non-trivial. But the fact is there's very little here to protect, and there's so much to damage. We have a multi-gigawatt market now. We are number 2 in the world.
Yeah.
And for now anyway. And basically we're important enough to affect everybody else from whom we buy product. We don't have enough here to serve our own demand of thin film or anything else. Right. So we're going to have to import no matter what, even if First Solar sends everything it makes in Malaysia here to the United States, we're still going to have to import crystalline. There's just not enough thin film to fulfill our market anymore.
Right.
So that means on the demand side, the smaller installers all the way up through big developers and EPC get higher prices, and their margins get slimmer because they really have the least negotiating power here. So everybody gets hurt. Who gets helped? I'm not sure. And India now is doing the same thing. And India's manufacturing is growing. So even though I don't think tariffs or minimum prices are really appropriate or actually ever help anybody, at the very least you could look at India and say at least their manufacturing is growing. So it's just problematic all the way.
Well, so collecting tariffs, so where does that money go? In theory, does it go back to the 2 solar manufacturers in the U.S. that are on this case?
No, it just allows them to compete. One of them is gone. The odds of revival have to do, if somebody buys them for, pennies on the dollar, will they restart manufacturing here? I don't know.
Yeah.
See, it's a very even if a Chinese manufacturer bought them, it's a really expensive decision to start manufacturing in the U.S. And you have to take a look at the market and say, is it long term? And unfortunately, with Mr. Trump in office, we don't know that. Yeah. So we don't know what's going to happen to the ITC. It could be changed, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So it's an expensive decision. The revival of Suniva, I would say, close to zero odds. The revival of Solar World may be slightly higher, but I'm not sure I buy that. Companies that will benefit are LG and SunPower and First Solar and pretty much any manufacturer who can then raise their prices shipping into the U.S. So all the thin film guys raise their prices, and they have suddenly margin cushion, which, as you well know, I argue for at least a 30% margin for manufacturing because that margin runs the entire company. But nonetheless, it's going to hurt people. And so it's a very complex issue. Understanding it actually is not a 1 or 2 month, testimony and dramatic statement thing. It really is unlikely to be handled well, and the outcome will hurt somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, that uncertainty right now, because of who we have in charge, is also played out with the Paris Agreement, and we're going to move on to our second topic. We're already a little above. So we're out. He's pulling us out. He's going to renegotiate a better deal. What do you think?
Well, number one, he actually hasn't pulled us out. No, but we can't be pulled out until after.
Right. Yeah.
So
it's going to take some time.
It was a staged announcement to talk about his deal, Mr. Trump's deal-making prowess. And the fact is that this was an agreement entered into by countries who see that climate change is the crisis of our time. It affects everything. Droughts, extreme weather in other areas. It's not a natural disaster. We are contributing to a global climate disaster.
Right.
We are one of the biggest polluters. So to stand up and announce you're going to make a better deal, my only comment on that actually is you can't make a deal with the climate. All right? You can't go to climate change and go, guess what? We want to just do this. Can you maybe push back a little bit of the encroaching disaster caused by mankind, including us? And the climate isn't going to listen to us because the climate doesn't do deals.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's absurd.
I know, and I wonder if Trump has ever seen those maps that show what Florida looks like after some sea level rise and his precious Mar-a-Lago. I'm not sure how safe that will be.
Well, the thing is, you have to actually, first of all, and I heard this on NPR earlier today, the climate change isn't something you believe in. It's a scientific fact. You look at the scientific facts, and they're very clear. 98% of scientists are there, right? So, this isn't a deal. You can't deal with disaster. You can't say, stop disaster, give us a little time. You can't continue to pollute and not contribute to the disaster. And it's not something, belief isn't the point. But then again, it's the point. Because if you staunchly do not believe the climate is changing and you just think it's weather, it's not going to matter to you how much evidence is shown you. And by the way, the report they're using, my understanding, is highly flawed. So the problem with since I'm an analyst, we've talked about this.
Which report are you talking about? The one that does
It's the report that the Trump administration keeps citing about this is highly flawed.
That's the flaw,
And that is what I've heard, since I don't know right off the top of my head right now, can't tell you which report it is.
Okay.
However, that is the problem with future forecasting for anybody. We all know the future doesn't exist. So for selling things like solar panels, you really are doing your very best assessment of the market based on trends over time. For forecasting the climate and climate change, you should be using trends over time, which make it perfectly clear that human activity is causing climate change. So for something like climate change, so as an analyst, I always suggest that for strategies of sales, use the conservative forecast and then be aware of the high and low.
Yeah.
In the terms of climate change, you better use the most severe outcome, because you don't want to be on the wrong side of history,
Yeah,
really, because then history will flood you.
indeed.
And you know
Indeed.
what? Let's actually talk a little bit about climate change. This is really an important topic. And, I'm solar only, but I know that you do, you study all of the renewables.
Yeah.
And I think you've been doing a lot with wind lately.
Yeah. There's really interesting stuff happening with wind. So I was part of a webcast yesterday about oil and gas companies getting involved in offshore wind. And I believe I've mentioned this before. And if you've read Renewable Energy World, this is a topic we're covering heavily. It's really interesting. So we have only one offshore wind farm in the United States.
Really?
One tiny little one. Just came online last year. It's only 30 megawatts. It's a baby. But we have a lot of companies that are buying up leases and investing millions of dollars to develop offshore wind in the U.S. And what's fascinating is that what happened in Europe is that a lot of companies that were skilled in offshore energy, namely offshore oil and gas, switched over, transitioned their business, diversified, went into offshore wind, and some of them now have completely given up the offshore oil and gas business and are fully focused on offshore wind.
Wow.
So we're trying to introduce the U.S. offshore oil and gas industry to the emerging business opportunities in the offshore wind industry, and it's pretty exciting. It's really fun. So we've got a conference we're going to be doing in August in Houston, Texas, putting these two groups together. And it's been really fascinating to see the interest. It's the right time for the oil industry to consider alternatives. And offshore wind is coming. It's going to be developed. And the question that, what I keep putting to the Texans I meet is the Europeans can come over here and do it. They know what they're doing. Or you guys can figure it out and do it here in the U.S. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and the wind model would seem to play more towards the utility model in general. What would you say about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the winds offshore are very, very, very strong. The resource is a much higher capacity of when you set up a wind farm on the onshore, you're talking 30% capacity factor. Offshore, you can get up to 50% capacity factor. The costs are higher because you're putting things out in the ocean, but they're coming down quickly. Similar to solar, there's all the same discussion there. Are we cutting margins too thin? Are we working too quickly? Are we worried about quality? All those same things are happening. But yeah, the resource is stronger. The load is on the coast. We know that. We've got a lot more people needing power on the coast than we do in the middle of the country. So it does make sense to go forward with lots of offshore wind, and I think it's happening. So it's going to be fun to watch.
Would you say that when a disaster does happen in an offshore rig, if it's a wind rig, it's unlikely to pollute for decades and decades the environment, right?
For sure. Well, yeah. I mean, of course, there's lots of environmental concerns that go into offshore wind as well. I mean, you're pile driving in the ocean. What is that noise doing to the aquatic marine life? What all those things. There's fishermen who get worried about what's that going to do to their business? But as we talk about with all energy, there is an impact, and what impact can you tolerate if you want the lights to turn on?
Yeah, and that's really back to what we're talking in terms of climate change. We are going to have to switch to renewables.
Right.
I think most people accept that. What they don't accept is the cost of it. And then when you get stakeholders involved, there are reasons to be concerned. And honestly, what we're doing to other species is something that concerns me highly.
Me too.
So moving forward, so we have less an impact on the environment in cleaner ways is something definitely to accelerate. And even I, solar girl here, or woman, or whatever I am, understands that all the renewables need to play a part. And I do not consider nuclear a renewable. Okay. But nonetheless, that's really interesting for me to hear about, because again, I'm all solar all the time.
Yeah, well, it's fun, and we'll keep reporting about it, and we'll keep keeping our eye on the tariffs and see what happens there, and really hope that the solar industry doesn't experience a major slowdown. Yeah. All right, we're out of time.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next time.
All righty. Bye.